Case 1. Susan Lawrence lived in Ocala, Florida, and was known in her neighborhood for frequent complaints about noise and children playing near her home. One of her neighbors was Ajika A.J. Owens, a 35-year-old mother of 4. For years, tension grew between the two women. What began as arguments about children playing outside slowly turned into repeated calls to police and angry exchanges. On June 2, 2023, that long-running conflict ended with a single gunshot that killed Owens and changed many lives forever. Susan Lawrence had called police many times before the shooting. Records showed she often reported children playing too close to her property and said she felt unsafe. On the day of the killing, Lawrence called 911 to complain once again about noise and children. Officers were on their way, but before they arrived, the situation escalated. Ajike Owens walked to Lawrence's home to speak with her. Owens stood outside the closed front door. She was not armed. She did not force her way inside. Video and audio recordings, later played in court, captured what happened next. Owens spoke loudly from outside the door. Inside the home, Lawrence responded with anger and fear. Without opening the door, Lawrence fired one shot through the closed door. The bullet struck Owens in the chest. Owens collapsed outside the doorway. Emergency workers arrived shortly after, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. Her children were nearby and would soon learn their mother was gone. After the shooting, Lawrence spoke to police and said she believed her life was in danger. She claimed she acted to protect herself. Investigators carefully reviewed the scene, the recordings, and witness statements. Police noted that Owens never entered the home and did not have a weapon. 5 days later, on June 7, 2023, Susan Lawrence was arrested. She was charged with manslaughter with a firearm, along with other related charges. The case drew national attention because of questions around fear, anger, and self-defense laws in Florida. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Lawrence used deadly force when there was no immediate threat. They emphasized that Owens was outside the house and that the door was locked. The defense argued that Lawrence felt trapped and afraid after years of conflict. Jurors were asked to decide whether that fear justified pulling the trigger. In August 2024, after hearing all the evidence, the jury reached a verdict. Susan Lawrence was found guilty of manslaughter. The decision brought a sense of justice to Owens's family, though it could never bring her back. In November 2024, a judge sentenced Lawrence to 25 years in prison. The sentence reflected the seriousness of taking a life and the lasting harm done to Owens's children and loved ones. Before we advance to the next case, if you enjoy true crime videos, this is the right channel for you. I post interesting videos on the channel daily. Please support my channel by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much. Case 2. Malika Griffin became linked to one of the city's most disturbing neighbor conflict killings. She lived next door to Jason Patrick Horsley, a young carpenter who worked with construction tools. Their homes were close, and they saw each other often. Over time, tension grew between them. What began as repeated arguments about everyday neighborhood issues later turned into a deadly act that shocked the entire community. Jason Patrick Horsley was 25 years old. He worked as a carpenter and often used tools for his job. According to court records and police reports, some of these tools were sometimes placed on the public sidewalk near his home. Griffin complained about this more than once. The sidewalk issue became a regular source of anger. Neighbors later said arguments between the two were not rare. The problem did not stay small. The anger continued to build, even when no one else was watching. On May 18, 1999, the conflict reached its final moment. That day, another argument broke out between Griffin and Horsley outside their homes. The disagreement focused again on the tools left on the sidewalk. Witnesses later told police that voices were raised and the argument was tense. Griffin went inside her home during the confrontation. She returned holding a 9mm handgun equipped with a laser sight. Horsley was turning away when Griffin fired the weapon. He was shot in the back at close range. The injury was severe, and he later died from the gunshot wound. After the shooting, Griffin ran from the scene. Police later confirmed she did not stay to help or call for aid. During her escape, she stole a vehicle at gunpoint to leave the area. Authorities quickly identified her as the suspect and began a large search. Despite their efforts, Griffin was not found right away. She remained on the run for years, moving across states and avoiding arrest. During the investigation, police collected evidence from the scene and from Griffin's home. This included personal writings and diary entries. Prosecutors later introduced these writings during the trial. The entries contained statements that showed racial hostility toward white people. Jason Horsley was white. Prosecutors argued that this hostility was part of the motive behind the killing. They stated that the shooting was not a sudden accident, but a planned act driven by anger, resentment, and bias. The jury was shown how the conflict had grown over time and how Griffin made a choice to use deadly force. Griffin remained a fugitive for nearly 6 years. In June 2005, she was finally captured in El Cajon, California. Her case had been featured on America's Most Wanted, which helped lead to her arrest. She was returned to Colorado to face trial. The trial focused on the events of May 18th, the history of conflict between the neighbors, and the evidence recovered after her arrest. In court, Griffin's defense suggested self-defense, but the jury rejected that claim. Prosecutors emphasized that Horsley was unarmed and walking away when he was shot. They also pointed to the weapon used, the laser sight, and Griffin's actions after the shooting as signs of intent. After hearing all evidence, the jury found Griffin guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated robbery, and motor vehicle theft. Griffin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with additional years for the other crimes. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the killing and the actions that followed. The court made clear that this was not a simple argument that went too far, but a violent choice that ended a life and affected many others. Case 3. Lenny Paul Tracy was a homeowner in Santa Clarita, California, whose long conflict with his next-door neighbor ended in a fatal shooting. His case is one of the clearest examples of how a neighbor feud can last for years and still end suddenly with loss of life. The story is not about a single bad day. It is about anger that built up over time, repeated calls to police, court orders that failed to calm the situation, and a final moment that changed many lives forever. For nearly 8 years, Lenny Paul Tracy and his neighbor, Anthony Tony Davis, lived side by side while locked in constant conflict. According to court records and news reports, the dispute involved many complaints. One of the main problems centered on bright lights and surveillance equipment. Davis accused Tracy of pointing powerful lights and cameras toward his home. Tracy made complaints of his own, saying Davis harassed him and made him feel unsafe. Police were called to the neighborhood many times. The tension did not fade with time. Instead, it became part of daily life for both men. The feud became so serious that restraining orders were requested. These court orders are meant to keep people apart and prevent harm. In this case, they did not end the hostility. Neighbors later told reporters that the conflict was well known on the street. People nearby said arguments and complaints had gone on for years. Even with police visits and court action, the relationship between the two men never improved. The conflict reached its deadly end in the early morning hours of September 24, 2011. On that day, Tony Davis walked over to Lenny Paul Tracy's home on Calypso Lane in Santa Clarita. Reports state that Davis went to speak to Tracy about the ongoing problems, including the lights. What was said between the two men at the door was later disputed in court. What is not disputed is what happened next. Lenny Paul Tracy fired a gun at his neighbor. Tony Davis was shot outside Tracy's home. He suffered gunshot wounds to his upper body and collapsed near the doorway. Emergency services were called, but Davis died from his injuries at the scene. Police arrived quickly and secured the area. Lenny Paul Tracy was taken into custody without further violence. After the shooting, investigators began reviewing the long history between the two men. They looked at years of police reports, court filings, and witness statements. Prosecutors argued that this was not an accident and not self-defense. They said the past conflicts showed deep resentment that had never been resolved. The case moved forward through the Los Angeles County court system. During the trial, jurors heard about the lights, the cameras, the restraining orders, and the repeated complaints. They also heard testimony about the shooting itself. In November 2012, a jury found Lenny Paul Tracy guilty of first-degree murder. He was also convicted of assault with a firearm related to threatening Davis's wife during the same incident. In May 2013, a judge sentenced Lenny Paul Tracy to 50 years to life in prison for the murder, with additional time added for the assault conviction. The sentence meant that he would spend decades behind bars before even being considered for parole. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the sentence was read. Tony Davis's family spoke about their loss, while Tracy's future was permanently changed. If you found this video interesting so far, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. Case 4. Raul Rodriguez lived next door to Kelly Danaher in Texas, and in May 2010, a dispute over loud music ended in death. Raul was a retired firefighter who became angry about noise coming from a birthday party at Kelly's home. What should have stayed a small neighbor problem turned into a moment that ended one life and reshaped many others. On the night of the shooting, Kelly Danaher was celebrating a birthday at his house. Friends and family were there. Music was playing. People were talking and enjoying the night. Raul Rodriguez became upset by the sound. Instead of staying inside or calling police to report a noise complaint, Raul chose to go outside. He took a gun with him. He also carried a video camera and began recording as he walked toward Kelly's home. When Raul reached the house, an argument started. Voices became louder. The situation grew tense very quickly. Kelly stepped outside during the confrontation. Raul continued recording and also spoke to a 911 dispatcher during parts of the encounter. The disagreement did not calm down. It grew more heated. During this argument, Raul fired his gun. Kelly Danaher was shot outside his own home. Kelly worked as an elementary school teacher. Party guests and neighbors were shocked by the sound of gunfire. Emergency services were called immediately. Kelly was rushed for medical care, but his injuries were too severe. He died from the gunshot wound. 2 other people were also injured during the incident, adding more fear and chaos to the night. Police arrived quickly and secured the area. Raul Rodriguez did not run away. He was taken into custody. From the beginning, Raul said he acted to protect himself. He claimed he believed he was in danger during the argument. Investigators collected the video Raul recorded, the 911 audio, witness statements, and physical evidence. All of this became part of the case. Raul Rodriguez went to trial in 2012. Prosecutors argued that Raul chose to bring a gun into a neighbor dispute and used deadly force when it was not necessary. They showed the jury the video recording and played the 911 call. Witnesses testified about what they saw and heard that night. Prosecutors said Kelly was unarmed and standing outside his own home. The defense argued that Raul believed he was threatened. They pointed to Texas self-defense law and said Raul feared for his life. The jury found Raul Rodriguez guilty of murder. He was sentenced to about 40 years in prison. But the case did not end there. In 2014, an appeals court reviewed the trial. The court ruled that the jury instructions about self-defense law were confusing. Because of that error, the conviction was overturned. The ruling did not clear Raul of responsibility. Instead, it ordered a new trial. A second trial was held in November 2015. This time, the case took an important turn. Raul Rodriguez's ex-wife testified against him. During the first trial, she had defended him. In the second trial, she told the jury new details that harmed his defense. Her testimony became a key moment in the retrial. Prosecutors again presented the video recording, the 911 call, and witness testimony. They argued that Raul was not acting to protect himself. They said he went to the neighbor's house armed and ready for confrontation. The jury reviewed the evidence carefully. In the end, the second jury found Raul Rodriguez guilty of murder again. This time, the sentence was much harsher. Raul Rodriguez was sentenced to life in prison. The court ruled that his actions warranted the most serious punishment available. Case 5. John Reed lived next to Patrick Shunn and Monique Patinaud in a rural area near Oso, Washington. He owned nearby land, and for years there were problems between him and the couple. The conflict centered on property boundaries and access to a shared driveway that crossed the land. What began as arguments over land use slowly turned into deep hostility. By April 2016, that tension reached a deadly point. Two neighbors would lose their lives, and the quiet community would be left in shock. John Reed knew Patrick Shunn and Monique Patenaude as the couple who lived close by. Patrick was 45 years old and Monique was 46 years old. They were adults with established lives. Friends and family said they worked hard and wanted peace. They were focused on their home and their future together. The problems with Reed were not sudden. Court testimony later showed there had been repeated disputes over property access. The driveway became a symbol of control and resentment between neighbors who could not resolve their differences. John Reed was present in the area on April 11, 2016, the last day Patrick Shunn and Monique Patenaude were seen alive. After that day, the couple stopped answering phone calls. They did not show up for work. They did not respond to messages. When family members could not reach them, they reported them missing. Law enforcement officers began searching the property and surrounding woods. From the start, investigators treated the case seriously, knowing the couple's sudden silence was unusual. John Reed left the area shortly after Patrick Shunn and Monique Patenaude disappeared. His brother, Tony Reed, also left around the same time. Their absence raised concern among investigators. During the search, law enforcement found evidence that pointed to violence. Not long after, the bodies of Patrick and Monique were discovered in a wooded area near their home. Both had been shot. The medical examiner confirmed their deaths were homicides. The case shifted from a missing persons search to a murder investigation. John Reed became the main suspect as evidence continued to build. Prosecutors later explained that the killings were connected to the long-running property dispute. Investigators gathered physical evidence, reviewed timelines, and interviewed witnesses. The history of conflict between Reed and the couple played a central role in the case. Authorities believed the dispute had reached a breaking point, leading to deadly violence. John Reed was arrested and charged with murder. His brother, Tony Reed, also faced charges, but his role was different. Tony Reed later turned himself in to authorities. He admitted that after the killings, he helped his brother avoid detection. Tony Reed pleaded guilty to 2 counts of rendering criminal assistance. In exchange for leading investigators to the bodies of Patrick Shunn and Monique Patenaude, he received a 14-month jail sentence. He was not charged with murder, and he was not cleared of wrongdoing. John Reed's case went to trial in Snohomish County. Prosecutors presented evidence showing the long history of conflict, the location of the bodies, and Reed's actions before and after the killings. They argued that the shootings were intentional and tied directly to the property dispute. Jurors heard how the disagreement over land and the driveway had grown over time, creating anger that Reed could not let go. John Reed chose to testify in his own defense. On the witness stand, he claimed that he acted in self-defense during the confrontation with Patrick Shunn and Monique Patenaude. Prosecutors challenged this claim. They pointed to the evidence, the condition and location of the bodies, and the steps taken after the shootings. They argued that Reed's actions did not support a claim of self-defense. After hearing all testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury rejected Reed's explanation. In 2018, the jury found John Reed guilty of aggravated first-degree murder in the death of Patrick Shunn and guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Monique Patenaude. The verdict confirmed that the jury did not believe Reed's claim of self-defense. The court later sentenced John Reed to life in prison without the possibility of release. The judge cited the seriousness of the crimes and the clear intent involved. Case 6. Angel Perez was a 68-year-old living in the University Park neighborhood of Miami-Dade County, Florida. He shared the area with other families, including his neighbor, Jose Feuds. On December 19, 2021, a disagreement near their homes turned into a deadly shooting. What began as an argument between neighbors ended with Perez pulling out a gun and killing Jose Feuds. On that day, witnesses reported a verbal argument happening outside in the neighborhood. The dispute took place near the homes and was visible to others nearby. Voices were raised, and emotions were clearly high. Some reports said the argument involved Perez, Feuds, and Perez's girlfriend, while other accounts described it as a direct neighbor dispute. What is certain is that the conflict happened moments before the shooting and did not involve any break-in or forced entry. As the argument continued, Angel Perez drew a firearm. Police later confirmed that Jose Feuds was not armed. There was no evidence that Feuds threatened Perez with a weapon. During the confrontation, Perez fired the gun. The bullet struck Jose Feuds in the head. The shooting happened outside, in the open, where neighbors could hear the gunshot. Emergency responders were called immediately. Police and medical crews arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do to save Jose Feuds. He died at the scene from his injuries. Officers secured the area and began speaking with witnesses. The street was blocked off as investigators worked to understand exactly how the argument turned deadly. Angel Perez did not flee. He was taken into custody at the scene by Miami-Dade police officers. After gathering witness statements and reviewing the evidence, investigators arrested Perez and charged him with second-degree murder. Court records showed that Perez was held without bond during his initial court appearance. Authorities made it clear that this was not a random act of violence. It was the result of a neighbor dispute that escalated quickly. Jose Feuds was 54 years old at the time of his death. He lived in the same neighborhood and had no weapon on him during the argument. His death shocked those who knew him and those who lived nearby. Neighbors described the area as a normal place to live, where people expected safety and peace. After the shooting, that sense of safety was gone. There was no long history of violence between the two men that pointed toward a deadly ending. Instead, the shooting showed how a moment of rage and a poor decision could end a life in seconds. Prosecutors later emphasized that walking away was always an option, but that choice was not taken. As of today, the available information from public news sources does not specify the final trial outcome or sentence for Angel Perez. Reports ceased after his initial arrest and court appearance in December 2021, where he was charged with second-degree murder and held without bond. The case was likely still moving through the legal system after that time, but no updates regarding a verdict or sentencing are present in the provided results. Case 7. Howard Unruh lived in Camden, New Jersey, and in 1949, his name became linked to one of the earliest mass killings in modern American history. He was a 28-year-old World War II veteran who lived with his mother on a quiet residential street. To people who saw him from the outside, Howard seemed quiet and withdrawn. Inside his mind, however, he believed that people around him were against him. These beliefs shaped his actions and led to a violent event that changed his neighborhood forever. After returning from World War II, Howard Unruh struggled to adjust to civilian life. He had served overseas and came home carrying emotional and mental damage that was not treated at the time. He had trouble holding steady work and felt rejected by society. According to records later reviewed by doctors, Howard developed strong paranoid beliefs. He felt that neighbors and local shop owners disliked him, mocked him, and worked to block his success. There was no proof that these things were happening, but to Howard, they felt real and constant. Howard kept lists of names of people he believed had wronged him. These lists included neighbors and workers from nearby stores. Doctors later explained that this behavior showed a deep mental illness. Over time, Howard became more isolated. He spoke less to others and stayed inside his home more often. His anger did not fade. It stayed with him, growing stronger as the months passed. On the morning of September 6, 1949, Howard Unruh left his home carrying a German Luger P-08 pistol, a weapon he had brought back from the war. He stepped onto the streets of his neighborhood while many people were starting their day. Over a period of about 12 minutes, he walked through nearby homes and small businesses. As he moved, he shot people he encountered. Some were neighbors. Others were shop workers who happened to be there that morning. By the time the shooting stopped, 13 people were dead and several others were wounded. The victims included men, women, and even children. The attack shocked everyone who witnessed it. People ran for cover. Some hid inside their homes. Others tried to help the injured while waiting for police to arrive. The violence was sudden and overwhelming, leaving the neighborhood frozen in fear. Police officers responded quickly once reports came in. After searching the area, they found Howard Unruh inside his home. He had barricaded himself inside with his mother present. Officers surrounded the house and spoke to him from outside. After a short standoff, Howard surrendered peacefully. He was taken into custody without further harm. Howard was charged with murder, but his case did not move forward in the usual way. Doctors examined him and concluded that he was severely mentally ill. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Because of this diagnosis, the court ruled that he was not mentally fit to stand trial. Instead of being sent to prison, Howard was committed to a state psychiatric hospital. Howard Unruh spent the rest of his life in mental institutions. He never returned to the Camden neighborhood. Over the decades, he remained under care and supervision. He died in 2009 at the age of 88, having spent more than 60 years confined due to his illness and actions. Case 8. Sigfredo Cheja Alvarez was a neighbor living near actor Jonathan Joss in San Antonio, Texas. For years, his name appeared again and again in police records tied to arguments and complaints in the neighborhood. On June 1, 2025, that long history ended in a fatal shooting. By the end of that day, Jonathan Joss was dead and Sigfredo Cheja Alvarez was under arrest, accused of murder. Police records show that problems between Sigfredo Cheja Alvarez and Jonathan Joss did not begin suddenly. Officers had been called to the area many times over several years. These calls involved disputes, arguments, and reports of ongoing trouble between the two men. Neighbors later said the tension was well known and had become part of daily life on the street. Even when police responded, the problems never fully stopped. The conflict stayed close, quiet at times, but always present. Jonathan Joss was widely known for his work as an actor and musician. Many people recognized his voice as John Redcorn from the animated show King of the Hill. Others knew him from live-action roles, including his work on Parks and Recreation. Outside of acting, Joss was deeply connected to his culture and his community. In the years before his death, his home had been damaged by fire, and he and his husband were no longer living there full-time. Still, Joss continued to visit the property to check on it and collect mail. Police reports later showed that calls linked to the address continued even after the fire. Records revealed dozens of calls made since at least 2023. Neighbors said arguments between Jonathan Joss and Sigfredo Cheja Alvarez never truly ended. Friends and family members later shared that Joss felt unsafe at times and believed the situation had gone on for far too long without a real solution. On June 1, 2025, Jonathan Joss went to the property in San Antonio. While he was outside, he came into contact with Sigfredo Cheja Alvarez. During the confrontation, Sigfredo Cheja Alvarez fired a rifle at Jonathan Joss. Joss was struck multiple times and fell outside the property. Emergency responders were called to the scene, but Jonathan Joss died from his injuries before he could be taken to the hospital. Police arrived quickly and secured the area. Sigfredo Cheja Alvarez was found nearby and taken into custody. According to police reports, he admitted to shooting Joss. From the beginning, authorities treated the case as a homicide. News of Jonathan Joss's death spread quickly. Fans around the world reacted with shock and sadness. Many people spoke about how much his work meant to them and how familiar his voice felt from years of watching King of the Hill. Others focused on the painful way his life ended. His husband spoke publicly after the shooting, saying the couple had faced ongoing problems in the neighborhood and had asked for help in the past. Investigators reviewed the long record of calls, complaints, and reports connected to both men. Prosecutors later presented the evidence to a grand jury. The history of repeated disputes played a key role in how the case was viewed. In late 2025, the grand jury indicted Sigfredo Cheja Alvarez on a murder charge related to Jonathan Joss's death. Court documents described the shooting as intentional. Alvarez was later released under strict conditions while awaiting further court proceedings. Case 9. David Graytack lived on the northwest side of San Antonio, Texas, and in September 2023, a long and bitter neighbor dispute ended with a woman dead and a man facing decades in prison. The conflict was not new. It had grown over time and centered on noise complaints between Graytack and his neighbor, Lydia Morales. What began as frustration over sound turned into anger, and that anger led to a fatal shooting. Lydia Morales was 44 years old. She lived in an apartment complex where family and friends often visited. Music, voices, and everyday activity became a source of tension with David Graytak, who lived nearby. According to court records and witness statements, Graytak had complained about noise from Morales' apartment on multiple occasions. The issue did not fade away. Instead, it stayed present and continued to cause arguments between neighbors. On September 12, 2023, the conflict reached its breaking point. That evening, Lydia Morales had family at her apartment. Music was playing and people were talking. At some point, David Graytak confronted Morales' daughter's boyfriend during a verbal dispute outside. The argument was heated. Lydia Morales came outside during this confrontation. What followed lasted only moments, but changed everything. David Graytak pulled out a gun and fired. Lydia Morales was shot near her home. Emergency services were called right away. First responders arrived quickly, but Lydia's injuries were severe. She was pronounced dead. Neighbors stood in shock as police secured the area. A long-running dispute over noise had ended with a life lost. Police arrested David Graytak at the scene. During questioning, he claimed he acted to protect himself. He told investigators he felt threatened during the confrontation. Officers collected evidence, including surveillance video from the apartment complex, witness statements, and physical evidence. Prosecutors later said the video contradicted Graytak's version of events. The case moved into the court system in Bexar County. Prosecutors charged David Graytak with murder. They argued that he brought a gun into a neighbor dispute and used deadly force when it was not justified. They pointed to video footage, witness testimony, and the history of noise complaints as proof that this was not an act of self-protection. The first trial took place in May 2025. Jurors listened to testimony from witnesses, reviewed surveillance footage, and heard arguments from both sides. The defense continued to claim self-defense. After days of deliberation, the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. The judge declared a mistrial. For Lydia Morales' family, the lack of a decision meant more waiting and more pain. Prosecutors chose to try the case again. A second trial was scheduled later in 2025. During this trial, the state again presented evidence showing the history of the dispute and the moments leading up to the shooting. Jurors watched video footage and heard testimony describing the confrontation outside the apartment complex. The focus stayed on whether David Graytak truly faced a deadly threat. This time, the jury reached a decision. In July 2025, David Graytak was found guilty of murder. The verdict confirmed that the jury rejected the claim of self-defense. They determined that the shooting was not legally justified and that Lydia Morales' death was the result of a criminal act. Sentencing followed a few months later. In September 2025, a judge sentenced David Graytak to 30 years in prison. Under Texas law, he must serve at least 15 years before becoming eligible for parole. The judge also ordered financial penalties. The sentence reflected the seriousness of taking a life during a dispute that never required violence. During sentencing, Lydia Morales' family spoke about their loss. They described her as a loved daughter, mother, and family member who should have been safe in her own home. Her death left a deep hole in their lives. For them, the prison sentence could not bring her back, but it did bring a measure of accountability. Case 10. Timothy Sisko was living at an RV park in New Caney, Texas, in Montgomery County, when a dispute with a nearby neighbor turned deadly. According to law enforcement and local news reports, Sisko was accused of killing his neighbor, Billy Fisher, during a confrontation inside the RV park. What should have been a shared place to live became the scene of a fatal neighbor conflict. The case drew attention because it followed reports of ongoing tension and warnings made before the violence occurred. Timothy Sisko lived only a short distance from Billy Fisher, who was also a resident of the same RV park. News reports identified Sisko as being in his late 50s and Fisher as being in his late 60s at the time of the incident. People who lived nearby said both men had been part of the park community. Over time, problems developed between them. Family members later said Fisher had expressed fear and concern before his death. Reports showed that law enforcement had been contacted more than once before the fatal day, signaling that the dispute was not sudden. Timothy Sisko and Billy Fisher were involved in a confrontation in January 2025. On that day, deputies were called to the RV park after reports of gunfire. When officers arrived, they found Billy Fisher with severe gunshot injuries. Emergency responders tried to help, but Fisher was pronounced dead at the scene. The RV park was secured as deputies began collecting evidence and speaking with witnesses. Residents were told to remain in place while the investigation began. Timothy Sisko was identified by authorities as the main suspect shortly after the shooting. Deputies took him into custody without incident. Investigators said the evidence and witness statements pointed to a dispute between the two neighbors that ended in violence. Law enforcement made it clear that this was not a random act. It was a conflict between people who lived close to each other and had a history of problems. Timothy Sisko was formally charged with murder as the investigation moved forward. Court records showed that he was being held while prosecutors reviewed the evidence. At the time of reporting, Sisko had not been convicted and the case was still moving through the legal system. Authorities stressed the importance of letting the court process determine responsibility. They also stated that no other residents were believed to be involved. Billy Fisher's family spoke publicly after his death. They said he had contacted law enforcement before the shooting and had told others that he feared for his safety. These statements added another layer to the case and raised questions about how neighbor disputes are handled before they turn violent. Case 11. Johnny D. Allen Miller lived in an apartment complex in Abilene, Texas. He shared that space with many neighbors, including Aaron Howard. On September 1, 2018, Miller decided a heated neighbor dispute that ended a life. A disagreement over a discarded mattress turned into gunfire. By the end of that day, Aaron Howard was dead, and Johnny Miller would later face a murder conviction that changed his life forever. The conflict began over a dirty mattress that had been moved into a shared area near the apartments. The mattress became a source of anger and blame. Aaron Howard, who was 37 years old, was upset about where it had been placed and believed it should not be there. He confronted Johnny Miller about the mattress. Miller's adult son, Michael Theodore Miller, was also present. The argument happened outside, in full view of the apartment complex. Voices were raised. The mood was tense. What should have been a short argument did not calm down. Aaron Howard did not have a weapon. What he had was frustration, the kind many people feel during neighbor disputes. His fiancée was nearby and began recording the confrontation on her phone. That recording later became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. The video showed shouting, insults, and rising anger. It captured how fast the situation was getting out of control. During the argument, Johnny Miller pulled out a gun. His son, Michael Miller, was also armed. Shots were fired during the confrontation. Aaron Howard was struck multiple times, including fatal wounds to the chest and head. He fell to the ground outside the apartments. Emergency responders were called right away, but the injuries were too severe. Aaron Howard died from the gunshot wounds. His death happened in a place where people lived their everyday lives, turning a normal setting into a crime scene. Police arrived and secured the area. Officers spoke with witnesses and collected physical evidence. Investigators reviewed the video recording closely. They confirmed that Aaron Howard did not fire a weapon and did not shoot at anyone. The focus of the investigation was on the actions of Johnny Miller and his son during the argument. The case quickly gained attention because of the video and the unusual reason behind the dispute. Both Johnny D. Allen Miller and Michael Theodore Miller were arrested and charged in connection with Aaron Howard's death. The legal process took years to reach an outcome. During that time, the video footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence were reviewed again and again. The case raised strong reactions because many people could not believe a mattress was at the center of such violence. In January 2023, the case finally reached verdicts. Jurors carefully reviewed all the evidence. They found Johnny Miller guilty of first-degree murder. The jury concluded that he was responsible for killing Aaron Howard. A judge later sentenced him to 14 years in prison. The sentence reflected the seriousness of taking a life, even though the crime was not planned far in advance. Michael Miller's case ended differently. Jurors found him not guilty. They decided that prosecutors did not prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This distinction matters. While both men fired guns during the confrontation, only Johnny Miller was legally held responsible for murder under the final verdict. The outcome showed how courts separate involvement from criminal responsibility. Case 12. Charles Robert Smith became connected to a deadly neighbor conflict that began with arguments over street parking. Police say Smith had ongoing problems with people living near him. These problems were not new and had been building over time. What started as frustration about where cars were parked slowly grew into serious tension between neighbors who saw each other often. The conflict reached a breaking point on June 11, 2023. That day, neighbors were gathered outside in a residential area of Annapolis. Some were talking, and others were spending time together near their homes. According to police reports, an argument started again over parking on the street and blocked access. Witnesses later told officers that voices were raised and the situation became heated. This was not the first disagreement, but this time it did not calm down. Prosecutors allege that during the argument, Charles Robert Smith left the area. According to charging documents, he later returned with a gun. Shots were fired into the group of neighbors. The violence happened suddenly and quickly. When the gunfire stopped, 3 people were dead. They were identified as Mario Antonio Mireles, Nicholas Mireles, and Christian Segovia. All 3 were neighbors who lived in the area. 3 other people were injured and rushed to nearby hospitals for emergency treatment. Those injured survived but suffered serious harm. Emergency calls came in almost immediately as people ran for safety and tried to help the wounded. Police officers arrived within minutes. They secured the scene, helped victims, and took Charles Robert Smith into custody without further violence. Investigators recovered evidence and began speaking with witnesses right away. The neighborhood was locked down as officers worked to understand exactly what had happened. Authorities later stated that the shooting was not random. Prosecutors said it was tied to a long-running dispute over street parking and access between Smith and his neighbors. Court records show that Smith was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of attempted murder and assault related to the injured victims. Smith entered a not guilty plea, and the case moved through the court system. As the legal process continued, the Annapolis community struggled to understand how a common neighborhood issue could end in such a tragic way. Parking disputes are familiar to many people, especially in residential areas with limited space. Neighbors said they never believed an argument over shared street space could turn deadly. Vigils were held to honor Mario Antonio Mireles, Nicholas Mireles, and Christian Segovia. Flowers, candles, and messages were placed near the scene as families and friends mourned their loss. Court proceedings later faced challenges. A mistrial was declared. As of the most recent updates, Charles Robert Smith has not been convicted, and the legal process is still ongoing. Prosecutors continue to present the case as one rooted in neighbor conflict, while the defense maintains Smith's innocence. Because of this, Smith must legally be described as allegedly responsible for the shootings. The shooting left lasting pain in Annapolis. Families lost loved ones who were simply spending time in their own neighborhood. Survivors were left to recover from physical injuries and emotional trauma. Neighbors spoke about fear and uncertainty, saying they no longer felt safe in a place that once felt familiar. Many questioned how long the conflict had been growing and whether it could have been stopped before it turned violent. Case 13. Robert Salone. In October 2022, a neighbor dispute over a parked car ended with a man dead and a long prison sentence that followed years later. The conflict did not begin with violence. It began with frustration over access to a driveway. That frustration grew into anger, and that anger led to a shooting that took the life of Christopher Dice Allen, a 33-year-old man who was working on his car near his home. On October 18, 2022, Christopher Allen was outside working on his vehicle. The car was parked in a way that partly blocked Robert Salone's driveway. Allen was fixing the car, not abandoning it. When Salone arrived home and saw the blocked driveway, he became upset. A verbal argument started between the two neighbors. Voices were raised. The disagreement did not cool down. It moved closer to danger with every second. During the confrontation, Christopher Allen called 911. He was trying to get help while the situation was still unfolding. According to police and court records, Allen was unarmed. He stayed near his car as the argument continued. Robert Salone pulled out a gun and fired. Allen was shot outside his home during what should have been a normal day of car repairs. Emergency responders arrived after the gunfire. Christopher Allen was rushed for medical care, but his injuries were too serious. He later died from the gunshot wound. Neighbors stood in shock. A dispute over a driveway that could have been solved with patience or official help had turned into a killing. Police arrested Robert Salone. Investigators learned that this shooting was not an isolated moment in his history. Evidence showed Salone had been involved in another violent parking dispute in 2021, the year before Allen was killed. That earlier incident involved a double-parked vehicle and led to an attempted murder charge. Prosecutors later described this pattern as important when explaining Salone's behavior. The case moved through the Clark County court system. Prosecutors charged Robert Salone with murder for the killing of Christopher Allen, along with attempted murder related to the earlier parking dispute. They argued that Salone reacted with extreme violence to everyday frustrations and chose to bring a gun into neighbor conflicts. In court, prosecutors presented evidence showing how the argument began, how Allen called 911 during the confrontation, and how Salone fired the fatal shot. They stressed that Allen was working on his car and posed no deadly threat. The history of the prior parking-related shooting was also introduced to show that this was not the first time Salone reacted violently over parking issues. Robert Salone did not go through a full jury trial on all charges. In April 2025, he entered an Alford plea. The plea covered the murder of Christopher Allen and the attempted murder tied to the earlier 2021 incident. Sentencing took place in July 2025 at the Regional Justice Center in Las Vegas. The judge reviewed the facts of the case, the loss of life, and Salone's history. After hearing from prosecutors and from Allen's loved ones, the court handed down the sentence. Robert Salone was sentenced to 21 years to life in prison. Under Nevada law, this means he must serve at least 21 years before he can even be considered for parole. During sentencing, the court acknowledged the impact on Christopher Allen's family. Allen was described as a loved son and friend whose life ended during a moment that never needed violence. His family spoke about the pain of losing him over a driveway dispute that lasted only minutes but caused permanent loss. Case 14. Colin Reeves, a former British Army soldier living in the village of Norton Fitzwarren, near Taunton in Somerset, England. On the night of November 21, 2021, his long and bitter dispute with the family next door ended in a brutal crime. By the end of that night, 2 people were dead inside their own home, and Reeves's life was permanently changed. The victims were Jennifer Chappell, aged 33, and her husband Stephen Chappell, aged 36. For several years before the killings, Colin Reeves and the Chappell family were involved in an ongoing neighbor dispute. The problem centered on parking. The street where they lived was narrow, with limited space for cars. Tension increased after the Chappells began using more than one vehicle. Arguments followed. Frustration grew. What started as complaints about where cars were left slowly became a source of deep anger. People who lived nearby later said the disagreement never truly went away. It stayed present, even on days when nothing was said. Jennifer and Stephen Chappell were raising their 2 young children in the home. They believed they were living in a normal, quiet place. Reeves lived next door and felt strongly upset by the situation. Instead of the issue being settled, resentment built up year after year. On the evening of November 21, 2021, Colin Reeves left his house and went to the Chappell's home. He was carrying a ceremonial dagger. This dagger had been given to him when he left the British Army. Inside the Chappell home, Jennifer and Stephen were downstairs. Their 2 children were upstairs, asleep in their bedrooms, unaware of what was happening below them. Reeves entered the house and attacked Jennifer and Stephen Chappell. Both were stabbed multiple times. The injuries were severe. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing doctors could do to save them. Jennifer and Stephen Chappell died inside their own home. Their children were not physically harmed, but their lives were changed forever in that single night. After the killings, Colin Reeves contacted emergency services himself and admitted what he had done. Police arrived quickly and arrested him. Officers recovered the dagger used in the attack. From the beginning, authorities treated the case as a double murder. News of the crime spread across Somerset and throughout the United Kingdom. Many people struggled to understand how a disagreement over parking could end with such a devastating loss. When the case went to court, prosecutors explained the long history of the neighbor dispute. They showed how anger had built up over several years and was never resolved. The court heard that Reeves had taken the dagger from his own home before going next door. This detail was important because it showed the attack was not sudden or accidental. Jennifer and Stephen Chappell were described as loving parents who cared deeply for their children. Reeves tried to argue that he was not fully responsible for his actions. This argument was rejected by the jury. In October 2022, Colin Reeves was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum term of 38 years before he could even be considered for release. During sentencing, the judge spoke about the lasting harm done to the Chappell children, who lost both parents in one night. Case 15. Ken Arslan lived next door to Matthew Borman in Gloucestershire, England, and by 2021, their relationship had broken down completely. What began as everyday disagreements between neighbors grew into a long and bitter conflict. The arguments were often about parking, shared space, and respect between homes that sat close together. Over time, the tension stayed constant and unresolved. That ongoing conflict would end with one man dead and another sent to prison. Ken Arslan and Matthew Borman had been in dispute for a long period before the killing. People living nearby later described repeated disagreements that did not stop. Parking was a central issue, but it was not the only problem. The conflict also involved noise, boundaries, and how shared areas were used. These arguments did not fade away. They returned again and again, creating constant stress between 2 neighbors who lived side by side. In 2021, the dispute reached its final and most violent moment. On the day of the attack, Ken Arslan confronted Matthew Borman near their homes. What followed was a sudden and extreme act of violence. Arslan attacked Borman with a knife. Matthew Borman was stabbed 27 times. The injuries were severe and overwhelming. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing they could do to save him. Matthew Borman died at the scene. Police arrived quickly and secured the area. Ken Arslan was arrested shortly after the attack. Officers gathered evidence from the scene and began speaking with witnesses. From the beginning, investigators focused on the long-running neighbor dispute. They did not treat the killing as a random act. Instead, they viewed it as the result of anger that had built up over time without resolution. The investigation confirmed that Matthew Borman had suffered multiple stab wounds across his body. Medical experts explained in court that the number of injuries showed the level of force used during the attack. Prosecutors later told the jury that the violence went far beyond any form of argument or disagreement. They argued that Ken Arslan's actions showed intent to kill. Ken Arslan was charged with murder, and the case went to trial. During the court proceedings, jurors heard detailed evidence about the history between the 2 neighbors. The court was told about repeated disputes over parking and shared space. Witnesses explained how the arguments had become part of daily life between the 2 men. The prosecution presented medical evidence, witness statements, and forensic findings to show what happened on the day Matthew Borman was killed. Matthew Borman was described in court as a man living an ordinary life in his own home. He did not expect danger to come from next door. His family spoke about the pain of losing him in such a violent way. They explained how his death had changed their lives forever. The court also heard about the effect the killing had on the local community, where neighbors struggled to understand how a parking dispute could end in murder. After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Ken Arslan guilty of murder. The verdict confirmed that the court rejected any suggestion that the attack was justified. The judge later sentenced Arslan to life in prison, holding him fully responsible for Matthew Borman's death. The court made clear that disagreements between neighbors must never be settled through violence. Case 16. Giorgio Pano lived in Airdrie, Lanarkshire, and for a long time he was in serious conflict with his neighbor, David Newton. The two men lived close to each other, and their relationship had broken down over many years. Arguments were common. Anger stayed high. This was not a short or sudden disagreement. It was a long-running neighbor feud that never found a peaceful end. On March 7, 2021, that conflict turned violent when Giorgio Pano stabbed David Newton in the neck during a confrontation at Newton's home. The dispute between the neighbors had been going on for years. People around them knew there was tension. The problems did not disappear with time. Instead, the hostility remained and continued to grow. On the day of the attack, the conflict reached a breaking point. Giorgio Pano went to David Newton's home on McAllister Avenue in Airdrie. What began as another argument did not stay verbal. During the confrontation, Pano used a knife and stabbed Newton in the neck. Emergency services were called to the scene. Paramedics arrived and worked to help David Newton. He was taken to hospital with a serious neck injury. At first, he was still alive. Doctors tried to save him, but the wound was severe. David Newton, who was 49 years old, died in hospital 3 days later, on March 10, 2021. His death turned the long-running neighbor dispute into a murder case. Police Scotland began a full investigation right away. Officers secured the area around Newton's home and gathered evidence. Witnesses were interviewed. Investigators also looked closely at the history between the two neighbors. Prosecutors later told the court that the attack was the result of ongoing hostility and was not an accident. The focus of the investigation was on Giorgio Pano's actions during the confrontation and his decision to use a knife. Giorgio Pano was arrested and charged with murder. The case moved through the Scottish justice system and eventually went to trial. The trial took place at the High Court in Glasgow, where jurors heard detailed evidence about the relationship between Pano and Newton, the events of March 7, 2021, and the medical findings that confirmed how Newton died. Doctors explained that the neck injury caused fatal damage and led to Newton's death days after the attack. In 2022, the court reached its verdict. Giorgio Pano was found guilty of murder. The judge described the crime as serious and violent. Under Scottish law, a murder conviction carries a mandatory life sentence. Pano was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a punishment part of 16 years. This means he must serve at least 16 years in prison before he can be considered for parole. It does not mean he will be released after that time. Any future release would depend on strict reviews and decisions by authorities. Case 17. William Nimmo's long-running problems with his neighbor ended in a violent death. Nimmo lived close to Robert Cleland, a 56-year-old man who shared the same neighborhood space. The two men had ongoing tension linked to noise, including loud music and the use of power tools. What many people see as a common neighborhood problem slowly became a serious and dangerous conflict that no one stepped in to stop in time. Robert Cleland was known to people nearby as a regular neighbor going about his daily life. Court evidence later showed that noise complaints had been raised more than once. These complaints caused frustration on both sides. Instead of the problem being solved calmly, anger built up. Neighbors later said the situation felt tense, but no one believed it would end in extreme violence. The disagreement stayed close to home, growing quietly until it reached a breaking point. On the day of the killing in July 2019, another argument broke out between the two men. According to evidence heard in court, the issue once again centered on noise coming from Cleland's property. The argument did not settle down. Instead, it turned physical. Prosecutors told the court that William Nimmo climbed a fence to reach Robert Cleland. This act showed clear intent to confront him directly rather than walk away from the dispute. Once Nimmo reached Cleland, the situation turned brutal. Nimmo attacked him with severe force. The assault was sustained and violent. Robert Cleland suffered serious injuries during the attack. Emergency services were called, but despite medical efforts, Cleland died from his injuries. His death shocked the local area and left neighbors struggling to understand how a noise dispute had ended a life. Police officers arrived quickly and arrested William Nimmo shortly after the attack. Investigators secured the scene and began gathering evidence. Witness statements, physical evidence, and medical findings were all collected. The investigation showed that this was not an accident. Prosecutors later stated that the violence was deliberate and driven by anger that had been building over time between the two neighbors. The case moved to the High Court in Glasgow, where the full details were presented. Jurors heard how the disagreement over noise had escalated and how Nimmo chose to confront Cleland physically. The court heard that Cleland was unarmed and did not pose a threat that justified such force. After considering all the evidence, the jury found William Nimmo guilty of murder. During sentencing, the judge spoke about the seriousness of the crime. The court described the attack as extreme and damaging not only to the victim but also to the wider community. Robert Cleland lost his life in his own neighborhood, a place that should have been safe. The judge made clear that violence over everyday disputes cannot be tolerated. William Nimmo was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 18 years before he can be considered for release. This sentence reflected the severity of the crime and the lasting harm caused. The court recognized the pain suffered by Cleland's family and the fear left behind in the community. Case 18. Daniel Wybrow was living in a block of flats in Newham, East London, when a long-running argument with a neighbor ended in deadly violence. A disagreement about a communal entrance door being left open turned into a stabbing that cost Raish Ahmed, aged 50, his life. Daniel Wybrow was 46 years old at the time. He lived in the same block as Raish Ahmed. The building had a shared entrance door that residents were expected to keep closed for safety reasons. According to court reports and witness accounts, this door became the main source of conflict. Raish Ahmed believed the door should always remain shut to protect residents. Daniel Wybrow disagreed. The issue came up more than once, and each time it caused tension. What might seem like a minor problem slowly became a serious and personal dispute. Neighbors later told reporters that arguments about the door had happened before. These were not loud public fights, but repeated disagreements that stayed close to home. Living in the same building meant the two men could not easily avoid each other. The shared space kept the problem alive. Over time, frustration built up, and the disagreement never truly went away. On October 5, 2024, the argument happened again. According to evidence presented in court, the dispute over the communal door led to a confrontation outside the flats. During this confrontation, Daniel Wybrow produced a knife. In a sudden burst of violence, he stabbed Raish Ahmed multiple times. The attack happened in front of others, including a teenage boy who was also injured during the incident but survived. Emergency services were called quickly. Raish Ahmed was taken to hospital with serious injuries. Doctors worked to save him, but the wounds were too severe. Raish Ahmed died 2 days later, on October 7, 2024, as a result of the injuries he had suffered. His death turned what began as a neighbor argument into a murder investigation. Police arrested Daniel Wybrow shortly after the stabbing. Officers secured the scene and began gathering witness statements. From the start, the case was treated as extremely serious. Investigators focused on the history of the dispute and the moments leading up to the attack. The knife used in the stabbing was recovered as evidence. When the case went to court at Snaresbrook Crown Court, jurors heard the full story. Prosecutors explained that the conflict was not about a single moment. It was about repeated arguments over the same issue, inside a shared living space. The court heard how the disagreement over the door had caused anger that stayed unresolved. Witnesses described the confrontation and the injuries suffered by Raish Ahmed. The jury found Daniel Wybrow guilty of murder. The judge made it clear that violence could never be justified by a neighbor dispute. Wybrow was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term that must be served before any possibility of release. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime and the loss of life that resulted from it. Case 19. Anthony Lawrence, also known as Tony Howarth, lived in East Yorkshire, England. And in January 2018, a long neighbor dispute ended with a brutal killing and his own death. The conflict was not vague or minor. It had a clear trigger. Lawrence believed his neighbors, Shane Gilmer and Laura Sugden, were responsible for him being served an eviction notice. He blamed them for complaining to the letting agency about his cannabis use. That belief pushed an already tense situation into deadly action. Problems between Lawrence and the couple had been building for a long time. Shane Gilmer and Laura Sugden had contacted police on multiple occasions, starting in January 2017. They reported ongoing fear and harassment. One incident involved Lawrence threatening Shane with an axe. These reports were logged, but the conflict continued. Over time, the stress and fear became part of daily life for the couple. When the eviction notice was served, Lawrence became convinced that Shane and Laura were the reason he was losing his home. On January 10, 2018, Lawrence acted. Instead of confronting the couple at their door, he broke into their home through an adjoining loft wall. This was not a sudden meeting. It was a planned entry. Lawrence was armed with a crossbow. Shane Gilmer was inside the house with Laura Sugden, who was pregnant at the time. What followed was fast and violent. Lawrence fired the crossbow at Shane Gilmer twice. The bolts caused devastating injuries. They entered Shane's arm, rib, spine, liver, and kidney. Laura Sugden was also shot. A bolt struck her in the head. Despite the pain and shock, she pulled the bolt out. Lawrence then used that same bolt to stab her in the neck. Laura survived the attack. Emergency services were called quickly. Shane Gilmer, 31 years old, was taken to hospital. Doctors worked to save his life, but the injuries were too severe. Shane later died in hospital. News of the attack spread rapidly. Neighbors were left in disbelief that such violence had taken place inside a family home during an ongoing neighbor dispute. After the attack, Anthony Lawrence fled. Police launched a wide search across the region. Appeals were made to the public. 2 days later, the search ended. Lawrence was found dead inside a motorhome in North Yorkshire. Authorities confirmed he had taken his own life through a drug overdose. With his death, there would be no criminal trial, but many questions remained. An inquest was later held to examine the full chain of events. It ruled that Shane Gilmer was unlawfully killed. The inquest confirmed that the neighbor dispute had gone on for years and that police had received multiple reports from Shane and Laura before the attack. Because of these prior contacts, the handling of the case was reviewed by the Independent Office for Police Conduct, IOPC. The review examined how earlier warnings and reports were managed. Laura Sugden survived the attack and later gave birth. She was left with physical injuries, emotional trauma, and the loss of her partner. Her life was permanently changed. Shane's family lost a son, a partner, and a loved one in an act of violence that never needed to happen. After the inquest, Laura Sugden began speaking publicly. She launched a campaign calling for changes to UK crossbow laws. She argued that crossbows should be licensed in the same way as firearms. Her campaign became known as Shane's Law. Through this effort, she has tried to turn personal loss into public safety, hoping to prevent similar attacks in the future. Case 20. Peter Kindle was an 80-year-old man living in a block of flats in Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire, when long-standing tension with his downstairs neighbor turned fatal. By January 2025, problems between Kindle and John Jones, aged 76, had reached a breaking point. The two men lived in the same building and shared common spaces. Over time, repeated disputes created anger and frustration. What began as everyday neighbor problems ended in a violent act that shocked everyone living nearby. Peter Kindle and John Jones had not been getting along for some time. Court records later showed there had been ongoing friction between them linked to daily living issues inside the block of flats. Neighbors were aware that the relationship had become strained. These were not one-off disagreements. They happened repeatedly and were never fully resolved. The shared nature of the building meant the two men crossed paths often, increasing tension rather than easing it. On the 3rd of January 2025, the conflict reached a deadly moment. Inside the shared hallway of the building, Peter Kindle confronted John Jones. What followed was sudden and extreme violence. Kindle first attacked Jones with a hammer, striking him in the communal area. Jones was badly injured but still alive. Instead of stopping, Kindle left the hallway, returned with a knife, and stabbed Jones. The stabbing caused fatal injuries. Emergency services were called, but John Jones died at the scene. Police arrived quickly and secured the building. Residents were asked to remain inside their flats while officers gathered evidence. Investigators focused on the hallway where the attack occurred, treating it as a serious crime scene. The medical examiner later confirmed that the knife wounds caused John Jones's death. The earlier hammer attack showed that the violence happened in stages, not as a single, sudden act. Peter Kindell was arrested and taken into custody. During the investigation, police learned more about the history between the two neighbors. Prosecutors later explained that this was not a random act. It followed a pattern of unresolved tension that had built up over time. Evidence presented in court showed that Kindell had researched information related to murder sentences before the killing. This was used to support the claim that the attack involved planning. The case went to trial later in 2025. During the proceedings, jurors heard detailed accounts of the events inside the block of flats. They were told how the confrontation began in the shared hallway and how it escalated. Medical experts described the injuries John Jones suffered. Witnesses spoke about the strained relationship between the two men. The defense raised the issue of diminished responsibility, arguing that Kindell's mental state reduced his responsibility for the killing. The jury carefully reviewed all the evidence. After hearing expert testimony and considering the facts, they rejected the claim of diminished responsibility. The jury found Peter Kindell guilty of murder. The verdict confirmed that the court believed he was fully responsible for his actions. At sentencing, the judge described the killing as a serious and deliberate act of violence. Peter Kindell was given a life sentence with a minimum term of about 22 years before he could apply for parole. Given his age, the sentence meant he was likely to spend the rest of his life in prison. The judge highlighted the harm caused not only to John Jones and his family, but also to the wider community. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I publish interesting true crime videos on the channel daily.